Thank you so much for that detailed, fascinating speech. Now moving on to our final speaker of the evening. Closing for the opposition, we have Marta Foresti. Marta's the founder of the social enterprise LAGO, a community working to find solutions to global challenges, including the political economy, with a focus on development and reform. You have the ears of the House.
Thank you. It's a delight to be the last one speaking. Let me start by saying that I'm angry. I'm angry about a lot of the things I've heard in this House tonight, mainly because, and I knew that when I saw the text of the motion, that there was such a risk that we were taking the global economy as a concept and then pile in all sorts of concept ideas about international issues, the North, the South, the East and the West, and have a conversation that we heard too many times in chambers like this around the world. I worked for years and years in international development, and so, in fact, when I was first asked to come to this debate, the assumption was that I was going to speak in favor of the motion, because if you look up what I've worked on for many years, that's probably would have been my inclination. Until I became very worried, and I will come back to this point at the very end, about the way we talk about the phenomena of the changes, the shifting powers in the global economy and international issues in ways that worries me, particularly that we are barking on the wrong tree and not necessarily following the way the world is changing and how that can be changed for the better. But let me come back to the motion, and let me say that we heard a lot of things tonight about the World Bank, the IMF, the US, the dollar, the Congo and China. But fundamentally, we were asked to consider that the global economy, and specifically the Bretton Woods institutions, were still imperialist. So we're talking here fundamentally about the World Bank and the IMF, which have been mentioned a number of times. And I want to go back to what we know about what has happened since 1945, when these institutions were first created. First, you heard it before, poverty has decreased, inequality between countries has diminished, even though inequality within countries has become much more prominent. The second thing is that low and middle income countries do borrow from these institutions, of course, but in fact, as an average, low and middle income countries borrow roughly 28% of their debt is from this institution, and even for the IDA eligible countries, which are the poorest countries, that goes up to 34%. The rest is borrowed on the markets. The rest is borrowed from China at much higher financing costs. So we cannot put the two things in the same basket. We're not talking about the IMF and the World Bank, China and the markets. So the situation is much more complex. There is such a temptation every time to say there is the fault of the IMF and the World Bank, that everything goes wrong in low and income countries, whereas so many other forces are at play. And we heard them tonight being mentioned left and right, whether it is other countries. They've now heard China being referred to as now part of the empire, even ironically part of the West. And other times, subsuming the global South. We really must stop this, blanket approach where we put everything that we want to point as evil in the global economy in one basket. Last point about the IMF and the World Bank. They provide a phenomenal amount of public goods for an empire, for an imperial force. All the data that tonight has been mentioned left and right, a lot of it is produced by the World Bank and the IMF. And so my considerations about these organizations that have many faults is that they have many faults, but behaving like imperialists, they're not. And so if they not believe, they not behave as imperialists, perhaps is because they're not an empire. And maybe the problems with the global economy and the world order is to be found elsewhere. So in other words, we are barking slightly on the wrong tree by having yet another go, the way we've been doing for 30 odd years, at the problem of the IMF and the bank. Let me come back to the IMF. Whether we like it or not, the way the IMF lends its money, can we all agree that the IMF is a lender of a last resort? It's the lender you go to when the house is already on fire, and which is one of the reasons why it's so perplexing to almost always blame them for setting the house on fire in the first place. It's the kind of fire that you don't need to go to the DRC every time. There was a mini budget in this country that a certain Secretary of State put forward that required the firefighters of the IMF to come in and extinguish. So the world is on fire. There are lots of fires. The world is on fire literally as we speak. In the Middle East, it's on fire in Ukraine. The real crisis is not the Bretton Woods, it's not the global economy. The real crisis is the failure and the changes in the nation states, and how that world order that you kept referring to as a given that has done so much evil in the so-called developing world is naked. That emperor is naked and dead. Is no longer can exert the power he used to. Can you seriously continue to talk about the West? What's the West?
Power the UN or the Security Council has is still active about US hegemony since the Second World War. You can look at Iran,
Precise.
You can look at Chile, you can look at Vietnam, you can look at Iran, and now we've got
Can I?
we've now got Israel.
Point taken. I couldn't be more true that within the UN Security Council at the moment, with the situation in Gaza, there is still this lock where the US is preventing the ceasefire. At the very same UN, only a few months ago, when it came to voting for sanctions against Russia, surprise, surprise, a number of countries around the world did not follow the West and the traditional power in that vote. All I'm pointing out is that this world we've got is changing, and where the US and others can still exert their power is increasingly a situation that requires reform. My proposition is that the reform we need is not the reform of the IMF and the World Bank. That's not the place where I will start. It's a bit like reshuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic when you're trying to sort of, pick up two organizations of the global economy rather than the underpinning reasons why nations are on fire. The fires are blowing up everywhere. So let me come to a proposition, which is that perhaps rather than obsessing about whether the global economy is an imperialist one, we're perhaps, we should shift our gaze and think about where the potential for change is in this world where, where there has been this, this growth and this reduced poverty, and where there is the potential to change the way things happen. The first is that we should look away from what constitutes the membership of this institution, which is always nation states. At every step of the debate tonight, we kept referring to countries, as if all the change can happen in country between countries. Half of the world population today lives in cities. By 2050, 2/3 of the UK population will live in cities. We're going to have 43 megacities around the world with more than 5 million people around the globe. And the vast majority of those, the new ones, will be in countries like Nigeria, India, and China. Can we please shift our attention to what do we do to harness the potential of those cities that, by the way, contribute roughly 80% to the world GDP? And imagine a global economy, not that can be undone so that we finally punish the evil of the West, but that can actually leverage the potential of urban populations of the future and actually create resources and direct resources to go to the place where the potential for growth is. Isn't that not a more constructive debate than just having a go at the evil of the global institutions? Idea one, please. Precisely. Have we not heard tonight from colleagues on my side of the House that actually we have a system that potentially has rules that, if enforced, have a lot of potential for equality? I'm not arguing to shift away our attention from making those institutions work. My argument is that dismantling them will be a waste of time, and instead we need to enforce and make sure that those rules reflect the changing power dynamics in the world, including where emerging economies have increasingly greater power and leverage. China has been mentioned a number of times. What can we do about the green hegemony of China and others? While at the same time genuinely begin to develop ideas about creating bridges in parts of the world. I mention cities because I think as a glaring example where there is potentially a lot of common ground to be found in these parts of the world by sharing, by investing in places where the potential for growth will be, and those being in different parts of the world. And this leads to my very final point. The things that angers me the most about the debate we had tonight is the way we talk about the world, we talk about global issues in ways that we will never dare do if we were speaking about regional differences in this country or in my countries of origin. So my challenge to all of you is that the imperialists are not the Bretton Woods institution. The imperialist is us. The imperialist is all of you, in the way we talk about the global north and the global south, the west and the east, as if nothing has changed, as if China, South Korea, the DRC and Venezuela can just be put in a basket by virtue of not being the US of Europe, by not recognizing, I work a lot with African political leaders, mayors and others. They will be horrified by what they heard in this room tonight about talking about them, their countries, their potential, their resources. We've got to change that. I've had this conversation with audiences like this ever since I started in this thing called international development, and it's unhelpful. And guess what? There is a beautiful little blog out this week that looks at the countries, low-income, middle-income, and high-income countries, and shifts since 1945 in terms of equality, in terms of access to resources, in terms of political powers and all the improvement. And it shows basically a world that was north, south, east, west, and a world that is changing composition without a value definition about whether it's better or worse. And he concludes that the notion of developing countries should really be abandoned once and for all. And we should all take it upon ourselves to stop referring to things as different as the DRC, Venezuela, and South Korea as something called developing countries, and even, frankly, global north and global south, which is as confused as it gets. This perpetuates this inequality. This perpetuates imperialism, and we are all guilty of that. And who published that very beautiful little blog that argue that once and for all we should stop talking about developing countries, or for that matter, global north and global south? The World Bank. Go and have a look. There's some very interesting data produced to make the point. It really is time to move on in this debate, and we better start here, because if we can get this right, there is no chance that all those people that we really worry about their well-being in the developing world will have a better chance for a better future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to everyone for an exciting and fascinating debate. A few of our guests have some tight trains to catch, so I'll let everyone go now. But thank you once again, and can we have one last round of applause for all our guests? The eyes and the no doors.